but government officials from the US, the USSR, China.
How many times do I have to say this? The Russians heavily relied on Jarrah Bank to track their own moonbound craft because they lacked a radio telescope capable of doing so. They have also been involved in wheat deals with the United States since the Kennedy administration and are involved in many joint space flights with the US. Further, cosmonaut Alexei Leonov has been caught outright lying in a vain attempt to protect NASA. As we already established, not only did none of the Russian radio telescopes use the 2 GHz used by Apollo, the Russians heavily relied on Jarrah Bank to track their own spacecrafts.
The Soviets had mustered all their technical know-how to build the probe, but to score the propaganda coup of reaching the moon first, there was one thing they lacked. They had no means of tracking Lunik all the way. No way to prove they'd really got there.
Надо было найти способ, как заставить все человеческое общество поверить в то, что мы действительно попали на Луну. И вот тогда вдруг сообразили, что есть в Англии обсерватория в Jarrah Bank. У него были хорошие остро направленные антенны, пожалуй, лучшие в мир.
Yet, Alexei Leonov, the man Russia would have you believe was the first man to walk in space, claims to have tracked Apollo 11 during descent and during the moonwalk, all from the comfort of Moscow. In 2004, Leonov wrote a book with David Scott of Gemini 8 and Apollos 9 and 15. The book was titled Two Sides of the Moon. On page 247, Leonov states,
Everything was set up at the Army Engineering Research Center, known as the Space Transmissions Corps on Komsomolsky Avenue on the morning of the 21st of July 1969. The facility was fully equipped with the latest intelligence gathering and surveillance equipment. During the early hours of that morning, all television monitors and radio receivers were tuned into what was happening 250,000 miles away from our own planet. There were a few cosmonauts present, maybe 10 of us from the first group, and many senior military officers, together with intelligence experts specializing in the lunar program. The room was packed. We were all transfixed by the crackling transmissions from Apollo 11 Commander Neil Armstrong as he guided his lunar landing module Eagle down towards the surface of the moon.
Then, on page 248,
as I watched the grainy black and white images of Neil Armstrong taking his first tentative steps down the ladder of the lunar lander, it was the most amazing feeling. On the 21st of July 1969, everyone forgot for a few moments that we were all citizens of different countries on Earth. That moment really united the human race. Even in the military center where I stood, the military men were observing the achievements of our rival superpower. There was loud applause.
Again, Leonov wants us to believe that scientists in Moscow picked up signals from the lunar module as it descended to the moon and the television transmissions that followed. This reception would have been an amazing feat if true, because at the time of the lunar landing, Moscow was on the far side of the Earth, the side facing away from the moon. As you can see from this map, Moscow is located on the western edge of Russia, near Eastern Europe. Here is a diagram. It shows the Earth as seen from the Moon at 2018 Greenwich Mean Time, Sunday, July 20th, 1969, the moment Eagle landed at Tranquility Base. As you can see, or rather can't see, Moscow is on the side facing away from the Moon, and is therefore not visible from the Moon. If we zoom in, we can just make out Italy clearly on the edge of the Earth's circumference, further indicating that Moscow is not in line of sight with the Moon. Remember, to track a signal from space, the transmitter and transceiver must both be in line of sight. Just as radio telescopes can't track spacecrafts when their orbits take them behind the Moon, these telescopes also can't pick up these transmissions when Earth rotates the tracking stations out of view. So how is it possible that Leonov and his team could have tracked Apollo 11 from Moscow? We can also prove that Moscow would still be out of sight when it was time for the one small step.
This diagram shows the Earth as seen from the Moon at the beginning of the Apollo 11 moonwalk.
As you can clearly see, mostly the Pacific Ocean is facing the Moon at this time, and the only tracking stations in line of sight are Goldstone, Honeysuckle Creek, and Parkes, all of which are part of NASA's Deep Space Network. Again, Moscow is quite clearly not visible, and therefore, quite literally, is in no position to receive signals from the Moon. The only way Moscow could have received these signals is if there were a geostationary satellite orbiting Earth to relay them to Mother Russia. But in that case, they wouldn't be able to prove that these signals came from the Moon, because they would only be able to track the transmissions from geostationary orbit, not cislunar space. Most important of all, why would a Russian cosmonaut attempt to cover for the United States when the US were their archenemy? The same archenemy who since 1963 has been supplying them with tons of American wheat and to this day are now working together on joint space missions. ASTP, Mir, and the ISS, just to name a few. Alexei Leonov, I speak directly to you here. Here is a diagram. It shows the Earth as seen from the Moon at the moment the Eagle touched down. Here is another diagram. It shows the Earth as seen from the Moon when Armstrong took his small step. Here is a pen. Now, you show me where Moscow can be seen on these two maps. As far as the Chinese go, they are America's biggest free trade partner, and their economy is booming. You think they'll blow the whistle on their best trade partners?
Australia and many others.
Do I really need to say it again? The Australian tracking stations are owned and operated by NASA. You think they just posted the NASA logo on their sign because it looks pretty?
As well as hundreds of amateur astronomers and radio enthusiasts who claim to have tracked the Apollo spacecraft all the way to the Moon?
False. No amateur astronomer or radio ham has ever claimed to track the Apollo spacecraft all the way to the Moon and back. At best, all they have ever claimed is to have tracked it when it was on or near the Moon, and if they're lucky, a handful of signals on the ride home. This is nothing that can't be pulled off with an unmanned spacecraft. In the June 1972 issue of QST, ham radio operators Paul Wilson and Richard Nadel wrote,
The Moon is always in view of two of NASA's primary tracking stations in Australia, Spain, and California, but not so for the amateur. Some of the most exciting events and transmissions from the Apollo mission always seem to occur when the Moon is below the horizon for the continental United States astronomer. Nevertheless, 5 lunar parking orbits and several hours of return trip transmissions were observed by this experimenter.
Further, the same article carries this warning from the Federal Communications Commission.
Important. FCC regulations prohibit disclosure of the content of communications not intended for the public. Thus, it is illegal to inform the press or any other third party of the content of any information directly received from the Apollo communications link.
How can radio hams possibly be cited as independent verification for Apollo when the FCC polices what little of their received transmissions that they can and cannot release to the public?